climate law that the European Commission has proposed is primarily about, as drafted in any case, is about the climate neutrality goal, so the long-term goal of reaching climate neutrality. And we know that obviously that's something that needs to happen in the EU and globally in the longer term. But actually, when it comes to stopping runaway climate change and meeting the targets in the Paris Agreement, what really matters is the next 5-10 years, because that's when we need very dramatic cuts in emissions globally. And we know that from the reports of the IPCC. The EU's current target of 40%, I mean, you ask why we need higher targets. The 40% target was set before the Paris Agreement was signed. This was in 2014. And the Paris Agreement, as we know, decided that 2 degrees of global warming on average was too much. That would be dangerous. And therefore we should pursue 1.5 degrees and certainly stay well below 2 degrees of warming. So the first answer to your question is just that the EU's current target is out of date because it was set before the Paris Agreement. The other reason is that we have much better information now on the science of what is happening and how quickly things are changing, and in particular the potential impacts and risks of exceeding 1.5 degrees. So we have the IPCC special report on 1.5, which makes clear that, you know, we're already at 1 degree above the historical average, and that's already causing very significant impacts and costs. If we reach 1.5 degrees, obviously that will get a lot worse, but 2 degrees is significantly worse than that. For example, in terms of how many potential tipping points you might pass. So what we've seen from the science is that we need to take very urgent action. The UN Environment Programme, UNEP, published a report last year on the gap between what countries around the world are currently pledging and what we need to do to stay below 1.5. And they said we need to cut emissions globally by 7.6% per year. Now, for the EU, that means by 2030, cutting emissions by 68%. And I mean, I note that is not a figure which includes any, if you like, equity considerations. So that doesn't include issues such as population or responsibility for historical emissions, which obviously would imply going even further. Now, obviously, 68% seems a lot higher than the 40% that's currently in law. It's more than the Commission is proposing, but we think that it is feasible using current technologies if the EU takes this crisis seriously and pursues maximum effort in all sectors.
I think what is really important is to understand, I mean, some of the lessons that we are learning now. I mean, what we are learning from this crisis. I mean, from the virus. And I think, I mean, there are, of course, a number of differences between what we are discussing in the climate policy field, but there are also some really striking similarities. I mean, sometimes I'm a bit shocked by these similarities. And I think what I'm trying to say is, I mean, if you look at, you know, what the virus has done to our societies, it's a very systematic shock. I mean, it has, I mean, we were talking about schools before. I mean, it has closed schools. I mean, very basic things of our daily life have come to an end. So it shows that, you know, it is possible that things that are taken for granted, that were just like a matter of course for all of us, that they end. I mean, that they're just are disrupted. And I think this is something that we are also looking at when we look at the climate crisis, and a systematic shock to fund the foundations of societies. So I think that is a very important lesson that we can, learn from what we are seeing now. Nothing is really for granted. Things can just get disrupted very drastically and sometimes in very short periods of time. So I think that is one important lesson from what we are seeing now. And another one is, and I think it's also very telling for what we're discussing today, is preparedness and time. Which countries have fared better so far? I think these were the countries that were better prepared and that they acted quickly in a way that were more resilient. And I think these are also a very important lesson that we are learning now for climate policies. What is the best way to prepare? What science tells us. What is the best way? And I think Alex Mason made a very important point, is that time is critical. It's absolutely critical. And for that reason, it's very important that action takes place now. And that means in terms of climate policies that emissions are being cut drastically and immediately. It's the foundation of science. And Alex Mason was referring to a number of reports. And I think it's crystal clear that, if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, because this is what science dictates, and what is very important for preserving the foundation of our societies, it's essential that we act now. So that I think it's an important answer to your question. Can we postpone it? The simple answer is it's like arguing with molecules of CO2. It's very difficult to argue with the foundations of science. And for that reason, if we are serious about climate action, it's not possible to postpone. So this is number one. But I think there's more. You were saying, the calls, that asking for postponing climate action. If I look at Brussels, a number of member states, I think, it's very clear that the wind is blowing in one direction. And it's increasingly understood across the board that climate action has to be the center of Europe's recovery. If you look at what the Commission has issued, but even if you look at what the European Council has adopted in April, I think it's quite clear that the narrative is about climate action has to be center stage of the recovery. And that's not only because of we need to preserve this planet, but it's also because we have to look after competitiveness of our industries in Europe. About innovation, keeping up the speed. And I think when we listen to the following speakers, I think innovation and competitiveness will be key. And I would love to see that what happened in 2009 with Tesla being funded by the recovery program. What I understand is like the first factory of Tesla. Just to give an example. Just an example of electric mobility was supported by that program. But at the same time, I think the recovery that we saw in 2009 was not the recovery that we should see today. In 2009, emissions have dropped quite drastically, but they picked up again in 2010, 2011. And if we are serious about time and about the next decade, we cannot afford another 2009. The recovery needs to be very different. There were some good elements of the recovery in 2009. I just mentioned this one example. Renewables is another example. But all in all, this recovery needs to be different. And it's pivotal that it is different. Otherwise, it will be very, very difficult to keep temperatures below 1.5, 2 degrees. And as Mr. Mason, Alex Mason was saying, tipping points, points in the climate system that accelerate quickly, that we are not looking at the linear reduction, linear development, are really critical. So in short, it's not possible to postpone it. And I think it's good that more and more stakeholders are actually agreeing with that in all countries, in all EU member states, from east to west. Thank you.
Sorry. I will start with the issue of climate neutrality by 2050, because I think that we don't have to talk anymore about the principle of agreeing or disagreeing with the principle, because the member states and the prime ministers have already agreed to the principle. So as the Confederation of Industry, we take it as given but we have many questions on which we expect to have the answers before any legislation is adopted. So just to use the words that the speaker before me has used, yes, time is critical, but for the industry, it's also critical that the EU and the member states act wisely in a manner that the impact on the EU industry and the existence of EU industry as such is being preserved, and the industry stays competitive and stays within the EU, which is the main question for us. The other thing which I liked in the speech before me, it was that the wind is blowing in one direction. Yes, it is blowing, but the question is, if it stops blowing physically, the industry still needs a kind of baseload electricity, and we need sources that will provide a stable and, let's say, not cheap electricity, but let's say electricity with stable prices. But going back to ambitious targets and the increase of the targets for 2030, the question is, do we go for one target regarding the greenhouse gas emissions? No, we go for increase of all three targets. And we set since many years that basically these three targets are cannibalizing amongst themselves. And if we increase renewables and energy efficiency targets, it may have impact on the EU ETS, and the three targets are interacting, and then the EU should think about how these three targets should or could be put together. So this is one primary question, that we should not talk only about the increase of the greenhouse gas emissions target, but also about the other targets, renewables and energy efficiency. Regarding more concretely on greenhouse gas emissions target increase, as a Confederation of Industry, we always said that we need concrete impact assessments of all targets before they are given on the table. But not only impact assessments on the EU economy or EU as a whole, but we need impact assessments by member states and by different kind of economies. Because if you take Czech Republic and Poland and other coal-based countries, certainly the impact of the increase of the greenhouse gas emission targets will be different than on the member states, the industry of which has been already decarbonized. And certainly Daniel Urban will say more concrete things on steel industry, but it's not only about steel, it's about paper industry, about chemical industry and other industries which are let's say carbon heavy industries, and which we have to take into account while increasing the greenhouse gas emission targets. So just to sum it up, our recommendation is let's act wisely. Let's think about the impact on the EU industry, and the position of the Confederation as such is that we think that to keep 40% the target is not realistic, because only if we follow the targets as they are in energy efficiency and in renewables, we will certainly achieve more than 40%. But before we stick to 50 or 55, or even, which I consider really non-realistic, as the Parliament wants 65, so before we stick to any increase, we must see the impact on each of our industry sectors, and we must see the costs for the industry, and we must see actually if there are any funds or any available sources which could be used by our industry to tackle the impact of the increase of the targets. Thank you.
There are extreme challenges to make this a success for energy-intensive industries like our own. First of all, in the steel industry in particular, the problem is that the technologies that would enable us to produce steel with zero carbon emissions simply do not exist, or they are being tried out on a sort of a pilot level. Second of all, we are competing globally, which means that a Czech steel producer is competing against steel from Russia, from China, from Brazil, all of which have no climate policy, all of which do not price carbon, which means that local producers have a competitive advantage over European producers. And if we think that we're going to produce steel with zero or very little carbon emissions, then realistically I can only think of two ways. One is using scrap, getting recycling steel and then using it in electric furnaces, which is great. We're doing that already these days. But we have two problems. One, there's not enough scrap in the world. Two, you need a lot of electricity, and the electricity must be priced competitively. The second way, which is being explored, for example, in Sweden, is making steel using hydrogen. For this too, you need a lot of electricity. Our European Association, Eurofer, estimates that to electrify the steel industry alone in the EU, you will need 400 terawatt hours of additional electricity. This, to give you an idea, this is about 3/4 of what Germany consumes today. So this is an extraordinary challenge. You have to produce this electricity, you have to store it because you cannot have intermittent electricity to supply steelworks, and you have to distribute and transmit this electricity. So you're looking at huge investments, both in infrastructure on the part of the TSOs, the DSOs, but also on the part of the steelmakers. And today, okay, there are rough calculations. If you make steel using hydrogen, then your steel will cost twice as much as steel that is produced in the traditional manner. So there will need to be a market in the EU for more expensive steel. So you will have private companies, you will have public institutions tendering, and they will have to explain to taxpayers, to shareholders, that they're not paying, that they are paying twice as much for steel to construct a building or to build a bridge than they would have if they bought steel from outside of the EU. And this competitive disadvantage needs to be leveled out. Without a level playing field, our industry as we know it in the EU, but also chemicals, cement, and many other sectors will simply disappear. But we all know that the demand for steel will not disappear. You still need to make washing machines, you still need to construct buildings and build bridges and roads. So this steel will eventually come from outside of the EU if we do not get the decarbonization of industry right.
We need, let's say, direct funds for directly impacted enterprises, job seekers, people. And for that, I think that the instruments like Just Transition Fund, EU Invest, and Just Transition Mechanism in general may go in the right direction. But we certainly are looking currently at what is being put on the table there, and it must fit into individual needs or individual member states, of individual enterprises, in order it really helps in our way to decarbonize and to become climate neutral by 2050.
I think different member states and different sectors are in different positions, so there should be differences in how they approach decarbonization. the tools they use and how quickly they achieve the goals that need to be achieved. As regards the support that industry would like to receive at the EU level or the national level, I think, for example, in the steel sector, we cannot do it without support in R&D to look at not only hydrogen steel making, but other possible ways of making steel without emitting CO2. Obviously, we are also looking at CCU, CCS. So this also is an area where European support or government support would be much appreciated. And especially looking at the industry now with the pandemic, having taken place, all the steel companies in Europe are cutting dramatically on R&D investments because they just don't have the money. They're losing a lot of money, and they will lose a lot of money in 2020 after they have lost a lot of money in 2019. So the industry is not in a good shape. I think we really need, what Susanna mentioned, we really need impact assessments on the member state level, and I think it's the responsibility of the national governments to carry that out. We need impact assessments from the Commission, looking at the individual sectors. There's some stuff is out there, but I think we need more. I think to decarbonize industry, as I said, it's a lot about electrification. So I think that this really is an aspect that I cannot stress enough, that we really need to look at having sufficient volumes of green electricity and being able to shift this electricity across the EU, or at least in the regional markets. And we have to take into account that obviously Spain will have a lot of solar, whereas countries like Lithuania will have more wind, and the Czech Republic probably a mix of that.
Well, I mean, I have been in very, very many meetings. Like this, and I have listened to what Commission, European Parliament, and Council has been saying this, and I can't remember a single meeting or a single conversation where concerns of industry were not part of the conversation. These concerns are always on the top of the agenda, but there are some parts of industries that have not understood that a very fundamental transition is needed and will happen, and that is what worries me. At the
very least, the EU can, stop making things worse. At the moment, we have, for example, EU agricultural policies which spend billions of euros in taxpayers' money on intensive livestock farming, for example. We have EU policies on bioenergy that are actively encouraging the use of bioenergy that increases emissions compared to fossil fuels. So, one of the first things the EU needs to do is to stop policies that are inconsistent with climate goals.